Hi guys. First of all, let me say a word about your annotated bibliographies. A few of you still haven't turned it in. Please do get that into me. Of those of you who did turn it in, I have graded all the ones that I knew I had. I did see a couple of more come in since I posted the grades on Saturday. What I will say of the ones who turned it in, the majority of you did very well. You followed the instructions. And that was the main thing I was looking for in this assignment, is that you followed the instructions. Those of you who got lower grades, that tells me you probably didn't watch the lectures and you didn't follow the instructions, because I clearly explained it in a couple of lectures at the very beginning of those lectures. So if you're wondering why you didn't get a stellar grade, I would say out of 20 points, 15 or above, and most of you got between 18 and 20 of those points. If you got very low, it's because you didn't follow the instructions. Some of you just gave me a list of websites. I can pull together a list of websites. I don't need that. I needed you to tell me why you wanted to use those websites and what you found there, including the possibility of giving me some quotes. If you didn't do that, then you didn't do well in your annotated bibliography. Of course, if you didn't watch those lectures, you might not be watching this one either, and so you might not fully understand yet. I know a couple of you have emailed me. Yes, I'll be kind enough to respond. The second thing I want to say is that at this point, you have most of the grades for the semester. What's outstanding is your class participation. So if you've been responding to some of the quizzes and other things, I know I've slowed down putting those on because I realize that some of you are feeling a little bit overwhelmed. So I'm going to look back at some of the quizzes that I've posted and see who's responded to those. So some of you are feeling quite overwhelmed with all of this, especially these changes. So I'm trying to slow down some of the assignments a little bit. So class participation. You also have a final paper which is due next week. That is May the 4th. Your final paper is due. And in that final paper, it ideally can be based off of one of your reflection papers. But in this, in addition to your own thoughts, you need to add a great deal of research. So in other words, you're supporting your own arguments. So whatever your argument is, what I would recommend is you outline it this way. This is my thesis. Put your thesis at the top of the page. Outline it this way, and I promise it will help you write this. Put your thesis at the top of the page. This is what you're trying to argue. Then lay out your points that you want to prove. You can do this in a Word document very easily. Write your thesis. And then lay out the points that prove your thesis as you understand it. And then write your thesis again at the bottom of the page. Now, read your thesis, read your points. Do they support your thesis? In other words, if you didn't have the thesis at the top and you read your points going down, maybe it's 6, 7, 8 points, would you come to the same conclusion? What I would even recommend is to give it to someone in that format. Send it to a friend, send it to someone else, and ask them, just without putting any material in there, do you come to the same conclusion? Can you agree with this conclusion, with my conclusion? Now then what you want to do is you want to go back then and you want to introduce your thesis in some way. And then you want to go back and support each one of your arguments with research. So the arguments that you lay out, your premises, are in your own words. But then you support your premises with research. Okay? So thesis, premises, 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 so on. Under each premises is research, premises, research, premises, research. That research is as much as it takes to prove that point. And then once you've done that, you ideally should be able to come to that conclusion. The way I'm going to read your paper is I'm going to read your premises. I don't care in your final paper if you want to number them. Numbering them is perfectly fine with me. That works for me. I'm not going to take off points if you want to do that. So I'm going to look for your premises, and I'm going to see, do they then lead me to the same conclusion that you have come to, which is your beginning thesis. Okay? And again, that can be based off of one of your original reflection papers. And the final thing is your final exam. I had originally thought it would just be that I would just let you choose some of the terms and I would choose some of the terms. But given how the final exam is going to need to be structured, it's going to be a quiz online, then probably the best thing for me to do is just to give you a list of terms and let you study those terms. So it'll be, I think it's, let's see, your terminology exam is 15 points, so it'll be 30 terms. So I will send you about 35 to 40 terms that we've talked about during the semester. I'll invite you to look those up. Then I'll give you a quiz, and you will answer what those terms are. I think it's just easier that way because, I mean, you're going to know half the terms anyway, and I'm going to give you a clue about another half of them, but, you know, essentially you're going to be able to look things up. I think the way the quiz will be online, so there's no way that I can prevent you from using a book or a dictionary or something like that to help you. So I think that's going to be the easier thing for me to do is just send you a list of terms, and I will do that in the next couple of days, so you'll have plenty of time. In fact, I'm making myself a note so that you'll have plenty of time to study those terms, look them up, whatever it is you need to do to prepare for the final exam. The last thing I want to say before we get started is I had promised to give you another lecture on Marx, Nietzsche, and the principle of utility. I didn't do that because I got busy grading your papers. So sorry. I'm having some of the same issues you all are in working with time in this new reality because it's much easier for me to lecture in class, but having to make specific notes and provide you a recorded lecture is taking up more of my time than ordinarily it would just by lecturing in class. All right, with that in mind, I do want to get into Marx, Nietzsche, sometimes Nietzsche, and the principles of utility as put forth by Bentham and Mill. So we'll begin with Karl Marx. Karl Marx has some basic points that I think it would be good for us to understand. He thought that most, not going to give you the background of Hegel because he becomes kind of an anti-Hegel in some ways. He's reacting. I should say this as we begin. Much of philosophy is a reaction to the philosopher that existed prior to your existence as a philosopher. You remember I've said several times that it's been argued that all Western philosophy is a footnote to Plato. So in some sense, we've been commenting and reacting to Plato for the last 2,000 plus years, if you believe that argument. We've been reformulating Plato, we've been rethinking Plato, we've been just trying to rework that and react to it. So all of Western philosophy then is a footnote to Plato. Another way to think of it is much of philosophy is a reaction to the philosopher just before you. So in my case, I studied philosophy of religion. I also studied ethics and theology. So much of my understanding in my own work is a reaction to some of the people, Dr. Gauss, Dr. Land, Dr. Hoffman, and Professor Borsch. So much of my Dr. Todd. So much of mine is informed by and a reaction to those. Interestingly enough, even though I wrote a degree in theology or a thesis in theology, wrote a thesis in philosophy, wrote a thesis in ethics, my doctorate ended up being in a branch of history. So go figure. So much of that is a reaction. So I'm not going to get into how these guys were reacting to, for example, Hegel. I'm just going to jump into them and begin to talk about them a little bit. And probably next week, I'll give you a lecture that brings together the important points of chapter 7 and 8. In particular, I don't know if I'll get into Husserl that much, but maybe some Heidegger, some Sartre, some Levi-Strauss, James, Dewey, Russell, Wittgenstein, probably get into those a little bit. Incidentally, there's a glossary at the end of this, glossary of philosophical terms. That's where I will take the terms from. I will take the terms for your final exam from there, just so you'll know. So, all right, getting into Marx. So Marx was born in Berlin, left Berlin, moved to London later, and much of his work is a composition or a cooperation between Marx and one of his friends named Engels. Here it is. My library is going to be a mess when I'm done with this class. I've got books all over the floor. I know it's backwards, but Marx and Engels. So much of Marx is a cooperation, though not all, I should say. But oftentimes they're spoken of together, Marx and Engels. Marx has some particular points that I'm going to lay out for you to help you think about him. First of all, Marx believed that humanity, as he was thinking of it, and again, we're talking in the mid-1800s, he understood humanity as being alienated, self-alienated to some extent. He thought that to be fulfilled, we needed meaningful work. So work that was somehow fulfilling to us. And with that work, we needed to be able to pour ourselves into it so that the work then reflected who we are. The way to think of this, I think this is the best way to think of it, is to have a job versus having a vocation, or an avocation, if you will. So if you have a job, and I'm going to assume most of you have a job right now, that's probably why you're going to school, because you want to do something else. But even that might be a job for you ultimately. A job is something that you work. You probably don't like it very much. You do it simply because it provides you with income so that you can continue to live. In other words, you work to live, you live to work. And this is what Marx saw happening to people, especially as the Industrial Revolution was beginning to take hold in Europe. That people were simply working, but they weren't working jobs that were fulfilling to them. A fulfilling job is very often called a vocation. I actually have a vocation myself. I love what I do. Yeah, I'm not making as much as an investment banker, but I make a good living. I'm able to take, trips every year. Last year I hiked across England. This year I was supposed to be in Prague and Vienna. That's been canceled because of the pandemic. I take a couple of vacations a year. I buy what I need. I don't have the newest car, but I don't really need or want the newest car. But when you compare that, so I have a vocation. I love what I do. I would do it if I didn't get paid for it. I've often said if I were independently wealthy or won the lottery, of course I'd have to play the lottery first, I would still do what I do. And all the money that I do make from it, I would give to someone else, give to a charity or something like that. I wouldn't necessarily take a salary. Not for myself personally, I would take the salary and give it away. So that's a vocation. My wife, on the other hand, has a job. She works in the pharmaceutical industry. She did an undergraduate at Vassar at Princeton. She did, at Vassar. She did graduate work at Princeton in chemistry. She has a job. She doesn't work as a chemist. She works in finance. She does analysis of all sorts of things, and she hates her job. She dreads Mondays. Actually, she doesn't sleep well on Sunday nights because she's dreading Monday. And even when she can take vacation, it takes her a few days to unplug from it. I'm on vacation. I don't usually do a lot of work, but if I get interrupted with a phone call for work or something or an email, I'll check my email. It doesn't bother me to reply because what I do is not work. The old saying is, do what you love and you'll never work a day in your life. So what Marx was seeing was that people were increasingly doing work that was not fulfilling, that they did not enjoy. And he saw this as a result of capitalism, and capitalism was beginning to emerge. So there was this emerging middle class of merchants and such, and they were beginning to develop the idea of capitalism. And this capitalism he saw as exploiting the labors of those who were the lower classes of people. That's why they were working without fulfillment, and that left them, in essence, alienated. Capitalism sought to make the laborer do work that only makes money for the class above them, and thus the worker can be dismissed arbitrarily. So most of you, again, have jobs right now, and you're not working for yourself. You're working for the person above you. You're working for the class of people above you. And this is what Marx saw. And for the most part, people could be dismissed. If you got injured at work in the days in which this is when there were no labor laws. And so if you got injured on the job, then they would just replace you in a heartbeat. You got killed on the job, sorry, here's the body. We're going to find somebody to replace you. Or if they just decided we weren't making enough money on the products that we have, then let's cut some labor. So we're going to cut some people out. And that way, now we're making more money because we don't need as much labor to do it. And so that's what Marx saw as a problem for the people. So modern work was alienating people, alienating them from themselves in some ways. It was also insecure, as I was just alluding to, that workers could be easily dismissed or replaced. And that's why Marx and Marxism favor unions. And that's why unionism is often hated, or unions are often hated by capitalists. Because when the laborers organize themselves so as not to be easily dismissed, and if they walk out of a job en masse, then it's not as easy for the capitalists to replace them. And so So Marx then would have advocated for the development of unions. It's interesting nowadays that the unions have been on the decline. But just as a side thought, if you enjoy the 40-hour work week, if you didn't have to work as a child, if you enjoy a weekend, if you enjoy a minimum wage, and other benefits like that, you have a union to thank. If you have a safe working environment, you have a union to thank for that. And so even though unions are on the descendancy today, it was in early 20th century unions that brought about many of the things that we enjoy today as workers, or at least people who have jobs. It tried to make the job a bit more palatable, a bit more accessible, a bit more enjoyable to the working class. And so this was in a way of trying to discourage the capitalists from dismissing workers or replacing them so easily. The third thing that we see about Marx is that he believed that workers, they get paid very little for their labor on the whole. And again, remember, this is the 19th century. And so he thought that labor was being exploited and being paid very little. The capitalists then were getting rich off of by exploiting the workers, and so they were profiting. And he saw this as essentially a form of theft and exploitation of the laborers, and he was against that. He believed that the work that we could do was what we had, that should be fulfilling. It was what we had to offer. And therefore, it should not be exploited and should not be robbed from us at such cheap wages. The next thing that we see about Marx is that he believed that capitalism is essentially unstable. Now remember, capitalism is emerging during this time. These are in the early days of capitalism. We're beyond that now. We're not wherever capitalism ultimately will end up. We don't know. As I said, I think in a previous lecture, no, it was in another class, I said it's quite possible in our lifetime we will see a trillionaire. And that's just beyond me. Trillion is with 12 zeros. And so it's quite possible in our lifetime that we'll see. We already have multi-billionaires, multiple multi-billionaires. But he believed that capitalism was ultimately unstable. He believed that capitalism needed crises after crises, and that capitalism lurched from one crisis to the next. And we've seen that perhaps even in your lifetime. I would say if you're between the ages of 20 and 22, 23, you've seen that happen in your lifetime. You might not have been aware of it, but there have been multiple capitalistic crises. In the late 90s, there was the dot-com bubble. So there have been real estate bubbles as well before that. Then there was September 11th, which put a halt to the financial markets. That's capitalism. Then there was the Great Recession of 2008, where lots of people were out of work. And we had to bail out the big banks, basically the capitalists. Then, of course, there is the current crisis. Now, it's a medical crisis, it's a pandemic, but it has caused a financial crisis for us. So just in the past 20 years, you can see 1, 2, 3, maybe even 4 crises in capitalism. And in one of those cases, you as the worker, you as the taxpayer, had to bail out the capitalists, which I leave it up to you to decide whether or not that was fair or not. Even now, you might have gotten a $600 or $500 or $1,200 check, depending on whether you're dependent or independent, based on your taxes or however it is. But that most of that money, however, from that $2.2 trillion bailout package, then they just passed another $500 billion. So we're getting close to $3 trillion. Most of that has not gone to you, the little guy. Most of that has gone to big corporations. And so I leave it for you to think about that, whether or not. But Marx would certainly say that's not fair. The capitalists depend on those crises, and the little guy is the one who usually ends up paying it. He said part of the crises were as a result of us producing more than what we needed. So we produce more than we need. And he thought that if we could rebalance that in some way, that we can enjoy more leisure time, that unemployment would not be a bad thing. So if you're unemployed right now, Marx would say that's not a bad thing. You should see it as freedom, as leisure, and that if you're collecting some type of unemployment, then that is what capitalism owes you for being a worker. And he believed then that if we could take the wealth that had gone from the workers, that the workers had produced on behalf of the capitalists, that we should be able to take that wealth and redistribute it. We're not going to leave those people at the top with nothing. We're just essentially going to redistribute it so that everyone can enjoy the maximum benefits of their labor. The final point that I'll make about capitalism that we understand from Marx is that capitalism is actually bad for capitalists. It makes them evil. He thought that people stay in relationships because they need economic security. And so that's one of the reasons Marx talks about reimagining the family. That's one of the things that he mentions very often. So a few more points to make about Marx. He thought that capitalism was also dangerous for us because of the way that it markets certain ideas to us. So capitalism keeps us busy working to produce the things that capitalists tell us that we want, which ultimately makes money for them, but then we spend the money that we make going out and buying those products that we have worked to create. And so the capitalists not only get rich on our labors, but then they also get rich by selling us those products. And so they market then those items to us that tell us that our life will be better if we only have this type of clothing or this type of shoes or this type of car or this type of home. And so they are using us and then they're making money off of us. And they market certain ideas to us as well. So not just the products, but they market certain ideas to us. You should work harder. You should work longer hours. You shouldn't have so much free time. You think 2 weeks of vacation? Oh my goodness, you really going to take 2 weeks? You shouldn't take all that time off. You should be working. You make more money. Just make more money. And also the fact that you should want more stuff. So all of that are the ways that capitalism markets a lifestyle to us that keeps the people at the top in their places. He envisioned, so this is what Marx envisioned, that there would be no individual or private property, that property would be held in common by all. And so I'll give you an example right now from the United States. Who is the largest landowner in the United States? It's we the people. We have land set aside. Well, Marx thought that should be the case with all land, that it should be held commonly, or as communism, it should be held commonly by everyone, that there should be no private property. That's not to say that you won't have a house to live in or you won't have your own car, but ultimately, it is held in common because it's from the common funds that those things are purchased then. The second thing that Marx would have advocated, or he would have envisioned, would have been that there would have been a graduated income tax. So the more you make, the more you would pay. The less you make, perhaps at some point you wouldn't pay anything in income tax. And that income tax would go to provide that property, would go to provide for defense and security and other things like that we need as a society. An example of that would be this. Um, or an example of something that Marx would say was wrong. Warren Buffett, at one time the richest man in America, maybe even the world, he makes most of his money off of trading stocks, right? And Warren Buffett pays a lower percentage of his income because he doesn't pay as much on the capital gains because they're from the stock market. He pays a lower percentage of income tax than does the secretary that works for him. Now, it doesn't mean that she pays more in actual income. It just means that because she is working for her money, she pays a higher rate of income tax. Whereas Warren Buffett has his money working for him. Do you see the difference? She works for her money. He has his money working for him. And as a result of that, he pays a lower percentage of income tax than she pays on the money she receives for her labor. And Marx would have said that's wrong. That the very fact that Warren Buffett has that amount of income that can work for him, there'd be no problem with that, but that he should pay a higher level of tax on that income, a graduated tax. The third thing that Marx would have envisioned would have been a central banking system, would have been a central communication system, and would have been a centralized transit system, so that those things are held by the people in common, or communism. It would have been shared by all the people. The fourth thing, and this is where the next one is where someone like Bernie Sanders got a lot of criticism, was that there should be free public education. Now, of course, we can enjoy public education for free in this country through grade school, middle school, high school. But beyond that, of course, a lot of states now do enjoy free 2 years of college, but a bachelor's degree will ultimately cost you. And Marx would have said, who will it serve if we have a better educated public? It will only serve everyone. And so Marx would have advocated for free education, for as much education as a person could actually achieve. That's not to say that if you're making bad grades that you can keep going. No, you would have to earn it in some way, earn your right into a particular college, university, but that if you earned your way in by your grades, that should be paid for you. And indeed, in some of the more elite colleges, they do that now. I believe Harvard and Yale don't charge their undergraduates anything, but you have to earn your way in. And in many cases, when you get into their graduate programs, you don't pay anything or much of anything. In some cases, they might even pay you to study there. It just depends. And then the fifth thing that Marx advocated for was to allow freedom to develop the self, or as we would call it, self-actualization. If we distribute the wealth around, then people are able then to find themselves, to enjoy themselves, not only in their labor, but in their leisure time as well. Two of the terms that are often associated with Marx are bourgeoisie and proletariat. And proletariat means the workers, the working class. Bourgeoisie means essentially the capitalist or the upper class. And so Marx saw this as a constant conflict between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. And this is where, so sometimes when you hear someone is bourgeoisie, it might mean that they are wealthy, or they come from a class of people where they don't have to work, whereas you seldom hear the term proletariat thrown around, but that means the laborers themselves. Now, of course, Marx in the 19th century did not have a huge influence on people, but by the beginning and into the 20th century, he'd had a profound effect on many of the people of the world. Of course, there's Che Guevara, there's Chairman Mao in China, Lenin and Stalin in Russia, and of course the primary Marxist country or communist country that still exists today is China, and they are rapidly catching up with the industrialized West in every way, and in some ways even surpassing. If you look at some of the architecture and other things that they have going on in China today, it is absolutely just staggering and monumental. And so Marx continues to have an influence on the world today in many respects. Our closest communist neighbor, as you might or might not know, is Cuba. I was really hoping to go to Cuba this summer, but that's not in the cards. So, but let me say one more thing about Marx and religion, because Marx is often quoted as saying religion is the opiate of the masses. And it is often interpreted as being a derogatory term or a derogatory thing that Marx was saying about people, that we need religion in order to keep us numb. It's taken out of context. If you actually read, and I believe there is a longer quote in here. Let's see if that's actually in here or not. Maybe it's not. No, that was somewhere else I was looking. Well, there is a quote. What Marx said about. So if you look on page 268 in your textbook, you do find a quote, the bottom of that page, what Marx said, and it is often taken. So let me tell you what I think he meant when he said religion is the opiate of the masses, the opiate of the people. Marx believed that religion actually was useful because it provided a balm, a healing for sick and the injured by reducing their immediate suffering. So religion then was useful because it helped relieve the suffering. It might be temporary in its relief of the suffering, but it does relieve the symptoms of the suffering. It reduced the immediate suffering by providing a pleasant illusion, which allowed people to continue in their difficulty. So just think about if you've ever, I've had a few surgeries in my lifetime and been in excruciating pain, especially before those surgeries occurred. I won't go into it, but it's you know, I've basically been cut all the way around my midsection, and had other injuries as well. And I remember, asking for, especially when I was in excruciating pain, I would ask for Dilaudid, which is a derivative of morphine. And sometimes they would give me morphine, and I would say, no, the morphine doesn't do it. I want the Dilaudid, because it gave me temporary relief. Now, all that did was it relieved the pain. It did not ultimately deal with the cause of the pain. So Marx believed that religion was an opiate because it could relieve the pain that people were facing in their life, and it would allow them to go on and to move forward. Just like when I had, the pain reliever, it would allow me to continue on until I could have the surgery that would take care of what was causing my problem. He believed, however, that one of the problems and where religion harmed people was that it kept them oppressed, and it kept them stuck within a class structure which prevented them from overthrowing their oppressors. Because he believed that in some ways religion was in cahoots with those in power, because both groups, the religious elites and the capitalists, they're both in a position of power, and so it's to their advantage to keep other people down. So he was not against religion per se when he said it is the opiate of the masses. Rather, he was saying that it is a good thing in some ways, although he had his criticism of it on the other hand. So don't take Marx as being inherently, naturally against religion. Okay, this has been longer than I expected. Let's go on to Nietzsche. So Nietzsche, much of he's also reacting to Hegel to some extent. And Nietzsche begins his philosophy in philology. So not to be confused with philosophy. This is essentially where you take philology, as it was understood in his day, is to essentially take a word and look for its origin, and by finding its origin, find its true meaning. But you would not only do this for a particular word, but you would do this for ideas and anything. Think of it this way. You're looking for the primary source of whatever it is you're discussing. If it's a term, you're looking for the source. If it's a word, you're looking for the original source. If it's for something like scripture, whether that's the Bible, which Jews and Christians would adhere to, the Quran, whether it's looking at the Upanishads or the Vedas, which we see in Hinduism and used to some extent in Buddhism, the sutras, you would look for the most original and most authentic source of those. And Nietzsche believed that we could not find those, that those no longer existed for us. They had long since disappeared. And so what we are left with then is a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. Someone claimed to be a copy of the original somewhere way back when. Now, we know this from the study of various scriptures. I'll just use the one I'm most familiar with, Christian and Hebrew scriptures. We do have some very early fragments, but we don't have what's called the original autographs. Not autograph as in sign, but what was written in the original person's hands. Those have disappeared centuries ago, and we'll never have those. So the best we can do is depend on the earliest translations or the earliest versions of those that we have. And so he thought then, as a result of that, there can be no pure text. There can be no pure knowledge. So anything that we claim as pure being, pure data, even our source for understanding the gods, or if you talk about Plato, understanding the forms or any substance, he thought it was all just made up. It was all essentially just like the gossip game that you play as a child, where I will tell you something in your ear. And if we were in class right now, we would do this. I would whisper in someone's ear, tell you once, and then ask you to pass it around the classroom. And we, of course, know that there were 30-something of us in the classroom. By the time it's announced from the last person that whatever started at the first person, it would probably be a perversion of that. So ultimately, he believed that then we exist within this state of chaos and this state of disorder, not knowing anything for real, anything for true. So all knowledge, all things that we claim to be knowledge, are invented, and they are basically a form of lying. So all knowledge then, as we understand it, they are a form of lying. But he thought then that there were small lies and big lies, white lies and black lies. So on the one hand, you have a sense of self-deception. This is one type of lie which perpetuates what one has been told by the traditions, so by the authorities. And there, take, for example, religion. Things that are passed down as religious practice and religious doctrine, religious belief and religious scripture. They're passed down to us, and that is a form of self-deception because we tell ourselves that it is true and that these are the things that we believe and that we should believe. The other type of lie was more creative. And it was the lie where we believe that we can bend reality to our wills. And that, he believed, was probably more accurate. And that was the better way of looking at it. And we could bend reality, or whatever we perceive as reality, physically, intellectually, and linguistically. We can bend them to our wills. And too often, he believed then, our language reifies, or it reinforces what we believe. So if you believe, let's see, I've got one over here. So if you believe that this is the Word of God, and you keep telling yourself that, and you then force yourself to read this and you think you understand it, then you are in essence just reinforcing it with your language, and you're deceiving yourself. When maybe you should be a little bit more creative with it and interpret it a little more loosely and in a different way. That would be the better lie to tell yourself. Then you would be shaping then that supposed reality to how you would understand it. So we taught then that the goal of humanity then was to overcome, to be overcomers, to overcome our habits, our perceptions, and especially our values. Overcoming, he interpreted, using a term that he had picked up from other philosophers, as the will to power. The will to power. And the one who would overcome, he referred to as the Übermensch, or the Uberman, or the Overman, not Superman. Sometimes it is translated as Superman, but it's Overman, Uberman. And truth is an expression of power then, and power can be physical, military, political, but more common are the power of our values, our perceptions, and our habits. And these are the things then that we try to overcome. We try to overcome our values, our perceptions, and our habits. And this is what we are trying to bend to a new reality that serves us rather than us serving it. So to overcome these means to create then, in some sense, our own reality. He believed, however, that even the best of us was probably closer to our nearest relatives, the chimps, the primates of our world, that we're still more closely associated with those than we are ever going to be in our lifetime, the Uberman. We just haven't gotten there yet. That is something to which we will eventually evolve ourselves, and it will take time. He would probably look at us today and think we're getting a little bit closer. You know, we've redefined marriage. We've redefined a lot of the social mores in our life. And he would say, yeah, you're getting there, but you still have a way to go. You're still constricted by too many of the traditional values, perceptions, and habits. So Uberman, then, is the result of our eventual evolution. Moral values for Nietzsche were the things that most needed to be reevaluated. And in that he thought of good and evil because they were most clearly defined by Christianity. Good and evil as defined by Christians. Moral values, when they were truly examined, in light of reshaping them to our own will, they are very complex. And that what we find out then is that most of our moral values are essentially cultural and social norms. And that when we begin to rethink them, it is good. So we should be suspicious then of those moral values that have been imposed upon us. This is sometimes called the hermeneutic of suspicion. The hermeneutic of suspicion. Hermeneutic means your way of translating. So you're suspicious of the way things are interpreted or translated to you. So we should hold then all of those values in suspicion. We should question them. You says you should not. It's taught thou shalt not steal. But where do we get that? Do we really want to believe that? Well, probably Nietzsche would say, yeah, when you break that one down, he would probably agree with, the categorical imperative of Kant. I don't want people to steal from me, so I shouldn't steal. But there are other things, this notion of marriage as being between a man and a woman. Does it have to be that way? Does it have to be? Maybe we can rethink that one. Does it have to be between just two individuals? Who's to say it can't be between three? And so those are the type values then that Nietzsche would try to get us to rethink, to look at suspiciously. Christian morality, he believed, is actually a slave resentment, because Christianity developed at a time in the Roman Empire when if you were a Roman citizen, or especially if you were in the upper class of the Roman society, then you could look down upon those beneath you, those below you. And so then Christianity developed then under this, within this underclass of Christians looking up at those. And so as slaves, as the lowest of the people, then we looked up at the oppressors with a sense of resentment toward them. And so those who had more, those who were freer than us, we saw as immoral. They were immoral. The Romans were immoral. But the only reason we thought that is because we didn't have those things. I'll give you an example. I grew up in a very conservative Christian tradition in the Deep South, where in my lifetime it was thought that to wear a watch, or even for some people they interpreted as wearing a wedding band, or to have excessively nice clothes, was a sin. But in time, as those people who were Christians and they were very poor, as they began to acquire more and more wealth, you began to see nice gold watches as a thing that they would enjoy, and nice suits as things that they would enjoy, and not only wedding bands, but a gold chain, a few rings. Maybe that's not so sinful as we first thought. And so that's how he believed that Christianity developed. They thought those things that other people did as being worldly and awful and sinful because they didn't have them. Because they were repressed. They were essentially of the slave class. Heaven, then, for the Christian, becomes the reward. And it's seen as a reversal of that slave resentment, where they become the people with. So they are so wealthy that streets can be paved with gold. And our gates are made of pearl. Our walls are of jasper, and there's not even a need for lights because we're lit by God. But, of course, those who were wealthy then, they were cast out. Think of the terms, into outer darkness. There's punishment and weeping. There's torture and torment. So the tables then are turned. So Nietzsche would say that this idea of heaven is something that really just comes out of a slave mentality, out of a wish to invert the system in which we live. And so when Nietzsche then says that God is dead, he's not making a theological pronouncement. Rather, he is making a statement based in sociology and history. He believes that as we eventually learn to reconstruct the world, the way that we live in it, that we move closer and closer to the Uberman, this overman. As we evolve toward that we'll have less and less need for God. And so God is dead, and we have killed him. So this is not a theological declaration. This is rather his look at society and at the progression of history. As we have evolved, we have come to need the idea of God less and less. Now, if you doubt that Nietzsche was onto something, I would challenge you, when was the last time you went to church? Most of you might have been a while. Some people in my classes never. They've never been to church. They have no need for God in that sense. Church attendance in the West is on a precipitous decline among all denominations. In fact, were it not for the influx of immigrants, and primarily they go into Pentecostal or Roman Catholic traditions, were it not for the influx of immigrants, all churches would be on a precipitous decline in the U.S. And of course, if you look at Europe, religion is a non-issue in most of those countries. So God is no longer the central organizing focal point of our lives. So he's not saying that God is dead as a theological statement. He's simply looking at the world in which we live, and he's saying God is less and less important, so God is dead. Your textbook makes the point of saying, it's just like saying Santa Claus is dead. But Nietzsche says, God is dead, and we have killed him, because we don't need God anymore. And he believes that as we continue to reinterpret our morality, as we redefine our morality in terms of our own lives and our own realities, that God will have less and less a central role and less a place. So not only is God dead, but God is continuing to die. Many of modern linguistic philosophy, many who work in the area of modern linguistic philosophy, still look back to Nietzsche. That's today, it's very often known as deconstructionism. So the idea of deconstructionism. Now, quickly, I want to move to utilitarianism, the principles of utility. I'm not going to go into this as much, looking at Bentham and Mill individually. I'm going to look at it as a holistic philosophy. And if you take my current moral and social issues, you take my ethics class, I will talk about utility a little bit more. But utilitarianism, in short, and it does, in some sense, it does become an operating principle of democracy. Utilitarianism seeks to find the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. That's what utility is. The greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. So what will make the most people happy? And when you locate that thing, when you identify that thing, that is what you strive to then offer to everyone. The other principle of utility is that each person should have one vote. So one person, one vote. Now we see that today in our democracy, the greatest happiness. Whatever people vote to make them the most happy is then what we define as the good. And that we claim that we have one person, one vote, but of course here in the United States we have the electoral college system when it comes to the president. Everything else is direct election, but not the president of the United States. That's because we didn't believe that slaves were actually people and we instituted the electoral college, but that's a lesson for another time. So then, as Bentham then articulated utilitarianism, John Stuart Mill came along later, and he began to say that, yeah, it is one person, one vote, but really what we should prize is the people who have had the most experience. Those who have experienced more should really have, they're the ones who really should have the one person, one vote, because they've had the experience of those sorts of things. Mill also took it a little step further and applied it in the to our economic system to some extent. And he developed an idea of what's sometimes called laissez-faire. The interpretation of that is best as hands-off. So a hands-off approach to the economy. So in that, the government, even though it would be derived from the people, the government then should not influence the way the economy works, or should not interfere then in the way the economy works. And so it's here in utilitarianism that you really begin to see a blending of capitalism and government. So what I'll challenge you with is the idea, the notion that must the United States have capitalism as its form of economy? Must our economic system be capitalism, or would it be possible for us to have some other form of economic system? Would democracy be at odds with communism, or better yet, socialism, or some other form of government? Something to think about. All right, guys, I'm going to leave it with you there. Next week, I'll try to get in the high points of Chapter 7 and Chapters 8. But do remember your paper is due a week from today. It's due on May the 4th. All right, guys, have a good week. Stay safe, stay healthy.